What has happened to the Minnesota Vikings defense? Because they have been exposed. These last 3 weeks, Jake Browning, Jared Goff, and Jordan Love, the Triple J threat, have just crushed and exposed the Minnesota Vikings defense. In the first half, the Minnesota Vikings defense was in control. But some way, somehow, Jake Browning and the Cincinnati Bengals scored 3 straight touchdowns in the fourth quarter. And that game went overtime. Vikings lost in overtime against the Detroit Lions. Jared Goff. And I get it, Mullins threw 4 interceptions. But most of his interceptions during that ball game were practically punts. You look and analyze his interceptions, and some of them were 3rd and long. There's a 4th and 2. There were punts. You don't complete that pass. Let's say it's just a normal incompletion. And that's as good as a Ryan Wright punt. So you really can't blame Mullins' interceptions for the Detroit Lions scoring 30 points on the Minnesota Vikings. And then Jordan Love leads the Green Bay Packers in a dominating 33-10 victory over the Vikings. And I did a podcast on Monday discussing what went wrong for the Vikings during that Packers game. And I received some comments from Packers fans because I was critical of Jordan Love a little bit. He was NFC Offensive Player of the Week or something like that, but I was still critical of his performance because he missed wide receivers wide open. It could have been a 20 to 30 point game at the end of the first half. Instead, it wasn't. It was 17-3. So, or something like, maybe it was like 20-3. It was almost 17-3. It was 17-3 with like 3 or 4 minutes left in the first half. So I think it was like 20-3 at the end of the first half, something like whatever. But the Minnesota Vikings defense, these last 3 weeks, have been attacked and attacked in the same part of the field. Every single time an opponent gets a big play against the Minnesota Vikings defense, it's in the middle of the field. It's the quarterback finding a zone in the middle of the field and attacking that zone. Brian Flores has been amazing for the Minnesota Vikings defense and for the Minnesota Vikings in general. His ability to make the defense look like they're doing something else. The defense has been an illusion so far this season. That's what Flores has been able to do. He shows one look and they drop back. He shows a drop back look and somehow the Vikings blitz. It's been that way all season. The reason why the Vikings beat the Raiders is because the Raiders scored 0 points. The Vikings defense shut them down. But even against the Denver Broncos and the Chicago Bears, as great as that defense was, and I would definitely put more blame on the offense for not winning those games. The offense still technically put the Vikings in position to win those games, and the defense didn't stop the Denver Broncos or the Chicago Bears on the final drive of the game. That's why they won. Russell Wilson led them to a game-winning touchdown on their final drive. Justin Fields threw a long pass, got them in field goal range on like 3rd down. You've got to criticize the Minnesota Vikings defense a little bit in those games, despite how amazing they were. But you look at these last 3 weeks, and that's really my focus, because all season long, the Vikings defense has looked completely different than last season. And you look at the perimeter, and you look at how teams are attacking the Vikings. The Vikings defense, their secondary, their cornerbacks, they're weak. Byron Murphy's aight. Blackman, Evans, these guys are okay. The Minnesota Vikings do not have an elite secondary. The Vikings have an elite defensive end, Danielle Hunter. They have a very, very good linebacker, Ivan Pace Jr. The Vikings are strong up front defensively. And as you get further and further away from the quarterback, the Vikings are weak. Especially if Byron Murphy Jr. is going to be hurt, then the Minnesota Vikings defense has no chance. And that's what we've seen these last 3 weeks. As amazing as Flores has been, opposing offensive coordinators have found the hole in the Minnesota Vikings defense. And it's deep down the field. The reason why the Vikings send so many guys at the quarterback with their linebackers and their ends and their D tackles. Sometimes Harrison Smith is blitzing. The reason why they're doing that is to force the ball out of the quarterback's hands early. And why do they want to do that? They want to force the ball out of the quarterback's hands early because the Vikings realize they don't have the secondary to cover opposing wide receivers. That's the game plan. Get rid of the ball early. Sack him. Confuse him. But what we've seen these last 3 weeks is that the Vikings' defensive blitz hasn't been as effective. And when they're not as effective, they're picking up the blitz and they're throwing it deep. Jordan Love, that's why he had the success he had against the Vikings. And even the missed passes that should have been touchdowns. Receivers were wide open down the field. And that's what we're seeing from the Vikings defense. That's got to be one of the biggest needs to address this offseason. I hear the quarterback. I hear the rushing. I hear all these issues on the Vikings all over their roster. Like, who's going to play quarterback for the Vikings? Will it be Kirk? Is it going to be a first-round quarterback? Are they going to sign somebody? Who's going to be the running back next year? How are they going to go from last in NFL rushing yards to middle of the road? How are they going to do all these things? But another important need on the Vikings roster is their defensive secondary. Harrison Smith is old. Cam Bynum's aight. Murphy's aight. But Blackman, Evans, Andrew Booth Jr., these guys ain't good. These guys are bottom feeders in the NFL. And if the Vikings want to have more success next year as a team, and if we want Flores, if he's back even, if we want Flores' defense to look even more dangerous next season, the secondary needs to improve mightily because the defense, the other teams have found the hole. That's what we've seen. That's why Browning and Goff and Jordan Love have had success. They've exposed the Vikings defense the way it is. Flores was a magic man to begin the year, but it ain't no more. We all thought when the Vikings defense was playing as good as it was that it was somewhat miraculous because Ed Donatel wasn't able to do much last year with pretty much the same group of guys. And Flores came in. He shot some Novocaine into the Vikings defense. And he was able to put together a scheme that quarterbacks and opposing offensive coordinators weren't able to figure out for a long, long time. But now they figured it out. Now the Vikings defensive secondary is injured. And they've got no chance. Even if they made the playoffs, 2.7% chance to do it. The defense would get obliterated against any team they faced. The run was fun this year, but this organization needs to shore up their secondary badly next season. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Minnesota Tim Podcast. I appreciate you making this podcast part of your day. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or Google or wherever, thank you for listening. And please rate, review, and follow the show wherever you are currently listening to this show. Everyone, have a great day.